Hey, Keith.
Hey there.
Good to see you.
Here we are. Yeah.
We're
Talking
heading into
food.
we're heading into the end of the year. We want to cover an important topic of food and mood and how what you eat can really impact how your brain functions, how you feel, longevity, your ability to do the things you want to do. There's probably something for everyone in that list.
Yeah. Yeah, let's do it. Where should we start off? Food's a big topic.
In my mind, I've taught a lot on these topics, and so I have a bit of a kind of overview that I could throw out just as a framework. I think it starts with, on a cultural level, we've had messaging from the US RDA and the FDA of what constitutes a healthy diet. And the food pyramid, many people, at least in our generation, can remember in the 70s being taught the food pyramid. And did they teach that in your...
I lived the food pyramid. Yeah. They taught it.
At the floor of the food pyramid in the 70s, with the biggest layer, so the foundation of what you're supposed to eat is carbohydrates. So rice, bread, wheat, anything.
Wonder bread.
Yeah.
Wonder bread.
Yeah. So it's easy to beat up on the refined carbs out there. And there's good reason for that. My favorite piece of scientific evidence that I think is really compelling to me is that the rise of obesity and diabetes in this country is closely reflected by the adoption of this food pyramid where carbs were the main event. And in particular, refined carbohydrates. We're not talking about whole wheat or brown rice or, things that your body has to really work to digest, but we're talking about simple sugars, refined carbohydrates, processed carbs. Think about candy bars and white bread, Wonder Bread. So these things not only spike our blood sugar, but they are largely they're the cause of an epidemic of obesity in children in this country. Sugar is another simple carbohydrate.
Yeah. It's also worth noting that more than 1 in 3 people right now have diabetes in the United States, pre-diabetes in the United States. That's a lot of people. That's 100 billion people right now, adults that have pre-diabetes. Isn't that wild?
It's incredible.
Yeah. And most of them don't know they have it. It's the other shocking statistic.
Yeah.
So
it'd be like saying this sort of analogy is like, well, if we knew that a third of the adults in this country were going to have a heart attack, but most of them didn't know they were going to have that. That's exactly what we're talking about here. And when you put it in those terms, like people don't think about diabetes as like a big scary event like a heart attack. Diabetes will get your leg cut off. Diabetes will cause blindness. Diabetes will accelerate heart disease. All kinds of really bad things happen to blood sugar regulation. It's out of control. So,
well, and not to mention when you have pre-diabetes, it means your blood sugar regulation, or you've already lost control. Your body has lost homeostasis on your regulation of blood sugar. And you're already dealing with a host of stuff at that point, which we could get more into. So here we are, right? Standard American diet, food pyramid, processed carb heavy, and a lot of simple carbs and refined carbs. And, so we're looking at things with very high glycemic index that ended up translating from the food pyramid, spikes blood sugar quickly in terms of high glycemic index.
Right. So this is what led smart people like Michael Pollan to say, for example, when you go to the store, you want to shop around the edges of the store where the things that you buy look like they were either recently alive or they're still alive.
Yeah.
They look like food. You get a box of eggs, you open that. If the eggs are in decent shape, they look like something that came out of an animal. Now, there are eggs, of course, that are done in a corporate way where there's pro-inflammatory signals coming from the yolks because, the chickens were raised in bad conditions with not very good food to eat. But what we're talking about is a huge, huge epidemic.
Yeah. And you mentioned obesity, and I want to come back to that because that's a complex topic in terms of when we talk about when we bring it to body appearance and how and body image, and it gets very complex there because people can obviously build a lot of shame around their body. Most people have shame. I mean, I have shame about my body. Most people have shame about their body somehow. Whether they're willing to admit it or not, some body part, some aspect of their body, their whole body, their appearance, whatever it is, right?
Definitely.
And so there's sort of this complex conversation that unfolds there of, well, we're going to talk about obesity, or we're talking about body composition too when we talk about obesity. But then like the next piece is, well, we're also talking about, how people feel about their bodies in that typically conversation.
Right.
And obviously we're not wanting to create shame for people or not loving your body, but we want to have a real conversation here about, well, look what's happening when you eat too many carbs. Like, look what's happening inside your body for one, and it's going to affect how you see the world and how you feel in your body. So it's just nuance is all I'm saying. For people who struggle with body size and the amount of fat on their body, particularly, pretty nuanced conversation.
Right, for sure. I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, we're talking here about the long-term health ramifications of what we eat. We're not here today focusing on the psychological aspects of, identity and shame and, fat shaming and judging and all that's real. And so I'm glad you brought that into the conversation. The interesting thing about diabetes and prediabetes is that it can impact people with any appearance. It's associated in people's minds with obesity. There are many, many, many people out there with blood sugar regulation problems who don't have excessive amounts of fat on their body.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I have prediabetes for sure. I've struggled a little with fat on my body on and off, not excessively in my life, but I have to work really hard to, keep my body composition healthy for me. And then, you're right. Like, there's plenty of people who have issues with prediabetes, and who knows, maybe they're a fast metabolizer or something, whatever it is. I don't know what they're doing to process, so that things don't turn to fat, but it's still there. Like, people are struggling with prediabetes who are leaner.
Yeah. Well, and so going back to the evolution of this problem in America, there were, I don't know if you're quite a bit younger than me, so maybe you might have been too young to get this messaging, but in the 70s, the message was, if you eat fat, you're going to get fat.
Yeah, I got that message. We had, in our house in the 80s, we had all of our milk was, 1%. And
that's it.
We were drinking water, but it looked like milk. And
that's what I'm talking about.
That stuff. We had all that. The cottage cheese was 0.2% fat. And
low fat. Yeah, exactly. And people were into these non-fat dressings for their salads.
Right.
It was all about the wedge of iceberg lettuce.
Totally.
With some fat-free dressing on it.
Yeah, with some Newman's Own fat-free dressing.
Exactly.
Yeah, we had all that. And because the idea back then was like, oh, if you reduce fat in your diet, you don't gain fat in your body.
That's it.
That was the idea back then.
Completely wrong. Turned out to be completely wrong. So luckily, and this is kind of one of the points of this episode for us coming into the end of 2024 is actually delivering what's the most up-to-date information here, for people who maybe haven't gotten the latest information.
Right.
That when we're talking about diet, there's macronutrients and micronutrients. So the macros, there's 5 macros, and they're all important: protein, fat, carbohydrate, water, and fiber. So water and fiber are the forgotten. They're sort of like the orphan macros. Nobody picks them up at school. Nobody writes them letters at camp. Nobody tucks them in at night. They're like these unwanted, forgotten kids that are really important members of the family. And it turns out that nowadays, in the 2020s, we know that not drinking enough water and not eating enough fiber are also involved in the development of insulin resistance and progression into type 2 diabetes. So it's not all about carbs and fat and protein. It's also these other macros that are important. How do you do with hydration in your world?
Me personally,
Mm-hmm.
I think I've been dehydrated since I was born. That's how I deal with it. I'm definitely chronically dehydrated. I mean, I always have to remember, one of my functional medicine doctors once said to me, your problem is you just actually don't have the signal that you're thirsty. I was like, oh, he's like, yeah, some people just don't actually have that signal that it kicks in until they're really, really, really thirsty.
Yeah.
He's like, you're one of those people. So I don't recognize when I'm thirsty. So like if I have to hydrate all day, it's because I'm forcing myself to create a pattern of just like, it's a good thing to do. It's not because I'm thirsty.
Yeah. I'm the same. I forget to drink water. I noticed a pattern. This took me a couple of decades to figure out. And I say figure out as in like I got the insight. I don't mean figured out like I've figured out how to drink enough water. So I'm still working on that. But I noticed a pattern from mountain biking. I historically rode my bike 3 days a week, 3 or 4 days a week, a lot of mountain biking. And I always brought water bottles or a Camelback backpack, and I would drink a lot of hydration when I was mountain biking. I would get home. I'd get home and I would think, man, I feel great. It must be the, endogenous opioid system. I've got the runner's high, the biker's high, whatever. I thought it was the exercise. And then it started to dawn on me that was the only time when I was actually hydrated properly.
Yeah.
Is when I was exercising. And so one of the benefits for me of exercise is that I actually hydrate myself somehow. In my mind, they're associated. So it helps me.
I mean, honestly, if someone had to start somewhere and they had to choose one thing.
Yeah.
And they had an issue in all the things we're going to talk about today, and they had to choose one thing, and we could wave a magic wand, they would get it right. I would be like, stay hydrated, because if you're staying hydrated, your brain's mostly water, so you're going to be a huge step ahead just by staying hydrated. So I tell myself that, but it doesn't work. But
well, and we live, in Colorado's kind of a desert, and it's very dry. And we're supposed to have more than 2 liters of water a day. I almost never get that much unless, like I said, on a mountain bike ride. So that's a factor.
Yeah. I mean, exercising hard helps me. I actually get thirstier, so I start to remember to drink more water on days where I'm weightlifting and things. I'll drink a little more because I am a little thirstier.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah. And I think that if I'm on a good cycle, I'll throw a little bit of electrolyte in my water just because I can feel that my body holds on to the hydration better with that. Right. It's not required, but it definitely helps me feel more hydrated.
Yeah. Totally.
So that's a good tip. But again, in the interest of thinking about insulin resistance and blood sugar regulation, a lot of electrolyte mixes have sugar, just straight up sugar in there.
They do.
So you have to look. You just have to read the label.
Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead. You get past water.
Water.
Let's go back to carbs.
Let's go back to carbs. Okay.
Go back up to carbs. Let's just hit that a little bit more. So you'll do a better job at this than me. So carbs, what happens is the glucose in excess in our bodies convert to fat storage if they're not used, right? And so that's what's often overlooked in culture when you think about fat storage and health and things like that, is that we're actually converting. People think carbohydrates, a lot of people don't know this. They just think carbohydrates, it's not fat. And so it doesn't, create fat, which is not true, right?
Right.
Yeah. So in this conversation, there's sort of multiple things with carbs to think about. And when I say carbs, we're talking about a spectrum of how many carbs you're eating. We're not talking about, you wouldn't do well if you never ate a carb again in your life at all. But we're talking about an excessive amount of carbs, the standard American diet amount. And just for reference, what are we saying that is about how many carbs a day is in the standard American diet? Over 140?
Oh, for sure. I mean, I think we're talking
180?
about 200 to 300 grams a day is pretty standard. The concept or the framework, kind of accepted framework of a quote low carb unquote diet is under 100 grams. Very low carb, under 50, I think the last time I looked that up. And, going into like under 50 grams of carbohydrate a day is a difficult thing to do. I remember when you were in a keto phase with your diet, and I remember having lunch with you and you were like counting tomatoes in your salad.
Yeah, totally. So, yeah. So, well, first of all, I want to share about that. So let's just kind of name a few things. So when we think about high carbs in the standard American diet, we're talking about a series of things to be aware of that you might be suffering from. One is you might have a issue in your blood sugar regulation, and we could talk more about that, right? Which is kind of leads into the whole prediabetes thing. You might have an issue in promoting too much fat storage, right? And so now your body composition is taking you down a road that's leading to problems.
Let me just say one thing about that real quick is,
Yeah.
again, when we're talking about body mass composition, we're not talking about shaming people who are carrying too much adipose tissue. What we're talking about, the problem, as I see it as a doctor, with adipose tissue is that it's a factory to make pro-inflammatory signals in your body. So it's an inflammation factory. That's why it's not great to carry a bunch of extra adipose tissue. It's not a aesthetic concern to me. I mean, it's a concern about what happens to your metabolism. So go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's important to keep returning to that again. Like, for me more than you, like you just seem, you're lean, like you've been lean. I mean, I don't know. I've never seen you quite get what happens to me. Like I have to work really hard just from my genetics. I mean, I don't know if you feel this is true, but my genetics, like I have to work really hard to keep fat down. And so I've had periods where I've, definitely felt like, wow, I don't like the way I look. So I think it's really important to keep returning to like, first of all, it's not about shaming that at all. And also that's not really what we're talking about today. Like that's a whole conversation we should have.
Well, I mean, to share my side of my experience, there's also dysmorphia around that is really common in men about not feeling strong enough or having big enough muscles and all of that kind of stuff. And in my effort I mentioned earlier a lot of mountain biking. So I pretty much had a mountain biker physique. But then I started measuring my blood sugar levels, and every year they were going up and up and up and up in my 30s and 40s. And so I started trying a lot of different things, and we could go into more detail there. But I ended up a couple of years ago in a place where I weighed like in the low 150s, and I'm 6 feet tall. And I went and got a DEXA scan, which is a body mass composition test. We'll talk about that today later. But I was in this kind of skinny fat zone of like having gone through intermittent fasting, ketogenic diet, and got into a place where I had lost muscle mass and put on fat, but I hadn't gotten bigger physically.
Yeah.
And so I needed to go through a radical kind of body recomposition path that I've been on for a couple of years now. So I could talk about that,
right.
But
yeah,
the blood sugar thing is something that you and I have both been hacking at ourselves for years now.
Yeah. I mean, the 1 in 3 is probably higher than 1 in 3 with prediabetes, or at least if you start getting into like, are you verging on prediabetes, then it's very high. So yeah, we've both been hacking away at that. And then another thing that comes out of that is just when you have unstable blood sugar due to high carb diets, now you're dealing with increased cravings. So then now you're also eating more calories than your body actually needs because you're in a cycle, right? So there's a lot of different things. And then you're also dealing with just overall systemic inflammation when these things are happening. So it's not a good playing field for having extraordinary mental health.
Well, folks who haven't listened to our show before we should connect the dots here between inflammation and mental health, because not everyone has heard about that connection. There's a huge body of research now that connects high levels of inflammation in the body with significant mental health challenges like depression, and even psychosis, bipolar disorder, PTSD, you name it, whatever diagnosis there's an associated level of inflammation that goes with that. It's a really helpful thing for us as integrative mental health practitioners to think about and try to address, because it's a lever that we can pull. Easier said than done, because there's a lot of behavior change, but it's a lever you can pull to reduce the intensity of symptoms by simply getting your house in order with your nutrition and your inflammatory pathways in your body.
Right.
And just the inflammation 101, inflammation is the body's way of fighting off invaders. It's completely healthy and necessary to have a spike of inflammation when you get a virus or you get a bacterial infection, but the healthy pattern of inflammation is it spikes up and then it goes way back down and to almost zero levels. What's happening for people in the situation we're talking about is chronically elevated levels of inflammation.
Yeah, and it's also good to say that, this is all have to be personalized in the end of the day. I mean, there are people that actually do well with high carb diets. And so it's not to say that, we don't want to go back to the food pyramid and be like, well, here's your food pyramid. This is the one that's going to work for you, because it doesn't work that way.
For sure.
But we can say that a lot of people who are eating high carb, highly processed carbs in their diets were having a diabetes epidemic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And we might as well throw in fast food with that, because there's all kinds of highly processed ingredients that are in the drive-through that you probably don't even know what they are, all of them. Right. So
you do.
I know.
How many years has it been since Wendy's?
I know what a number 2 combo with Biggie fries has in it.
How many years out are you from Wendy's?
So I made a deal with myself to stop going to Wendy's when I moved into an office that was adjacent to a Wendy's, because I knew it would be bad news for me. That was 2007. So
you're a while out. You're a ways out.
15. No,
you are 17 years out.
17 years out.
Yeah, you're ways out.
17 years out. I used to when I would do road trips, I would look for the Wendy's signs on the exit ramps, and I would get off if there was one there. Yeah.
No big deal. I used to go to, when I was a kid. Did you have Roy Rogers where you grew up?
No, I know what it is.
Roy Rogers.
Yeah,
and I would get a double bacon cheeseburger after baseball, and then I would wonder why I felt so bad after baseball. And I never made the link. It was the double bacon cheeseburger from Roy Rogers of why I was feeling so bad, because I was kind of good at baseball. I was winning most of the games, so it wasn't that. Yeah.
You get certain passes when you're a teenager and in your 20s. I think most people, not everyone, but your physiology is different than from now when I'm in my 50s, for sure.
Yeah,
not so many free passes.
No. I mean, that's true, especially if you're really playing the longevity game and you're really working at it. You start to discover the free passes you aren't getting when you put yourself under the microscope.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, are you talking about the continuous glucose monitor?
Any of these things like continual glucose monitoring, where you'll go and do a carotid scan to see how you're doing on, plaque building, and you're like, oh, I have the age of blah, 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 right? Or it catches up.
It does.
As we know.
Catches up. I mean, well, since you brought up testing, maybe we should go there for a minute and just talk about some of the things that you and I like to.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's talk about some testing. Again, this is looking at how food is affecting you, that kind of testing. I think continual glucose monitoring is amazing that in allopathic medicine, that hasn't become a complete standard that a middle-aged adult at some point, a CGM goes on them just to see how they're responding to the glucose. 100%. It's amazing.
Well, and not only in primary care, but in mental health care, right?
That too. Right.
I mean, it's just not penetrating the allopathic field at all.
I don't know about who we talk to, but most people we talk to have never had a CGM on them, a continual glucose monitoring. Would you want to explain a little what that does?
Well, to illustrate your point, I mean, in the beginning, and things are starting to gradually change now, but in the beginning, when CGMs came on the market, you needed, in order to get one, you had to prove that you had diabetes already.
Right.
It's like, what? The whole point is to use this tool to not get diabetes.
Right. Well, that would be a good point.
Yeah.
Like, we're not there culturally yet.
A lot of doctors who are on the front edge of trying to prevent disease and not just sit around and wait for the disease to appear so they can then treat it with drugs. These doctors, we could call them functional medicine docs or integrative docs, are often using CGMs as a vital sign. So you think about vital signs, you think about blood pressure, heart rate, temperature, and now blood sugar. I mean, it's such a common problem that we need to have the data to do something about it. And what's really cool is you and I have friends. I was having dinner with a friend recently who's a younger guy in his 30s, who, when he put on a CGM, was in the 120s in his fasting blood sugar, which is about 20 points above normal. Because he's in his 30s, he was able to make some very modest adjustments in his diet to get his fasting blood sugar in the normal range. And that would have never happened. He's one of those people that we were just talking about who don't even know that they have a blood sugar problem. There's no symptoms. You don't feel it necessarily.
Yeah.
So the CGM is useful for me for a number of reasons. One is I can see what my fasting sugar is. That's very helpful. I can see what changes my diet manipulations result in with the blood sugar. But there's a couple of really cool additional newer things that I've learned in the last year with my CGM is, number one, food combinations. So you were talking about personalized medicine recently, a few minutes ago. I have a friend in St. Louis, a dear friend, who put on a CGM and thought she was going to find out that carbohydrates spiked her blood sugar no matter what, and cooked a pot of rice, ate rice, did the experiment, looked at the CGM, no spike in her blood sugar. I'm like, wow, that's pretty good to know. I can eat brown rice and it's not going to hurt my blood sugar regulation. For me, when I have a cocktail, which I do a couple of times a week, typically 1 or 2 cocktails a week, if I eat a ball of mozzarella cheese or 2 before I have a cocktail, it doesn't spike my blood sugar. But if I have a cocktail, I'm not talking about one with sugary mixers in it. I'm just talking about like liquor. It will spike my blood sugar. So combinations is one thing that's really interesting to me right now. And then the other one is the timing of a workout in the gym with what I eat. So I used to think, when in my 20s, it was all about, if I was going to do a mountain bike race in college, it was, you better carbo load beforehand. Mm-hmm. Remember that?
Yeah.
You eat like a big plate of spaghetti the night before.
Yeah, or oatmeal. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Spaghetti for sure. Yeah, when I was in high school, I remember that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So nowadays, if I'm following my program, I'll have my last meal I'll finish eating at 7 p.m., relatively early. And then I'll get in the gym at 7 a.m. and not eat until 10 a.m. And that's actually really good for my blood sugar to not eat for 12 hours, even if I have a workout in that 12-hour period. And that has a big impact. So it's cool when you start figuring out like these, not just primary issues, like, okay, what am I eating? But also like, how am I timing it? What combination of, like, if I eat carbs after fat, very helpful. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about protein in a minute too, but those are some of the learnings that I've had in the last year with the CGM.
Yeah. I've learned I can't eat much carbs, but I still do some. Yeah. I'm just very sensitive to a lot of different versions of carbs. So I think my ideal target is, probably 100 grams of carbs a day. Mm-hmm. From over right now, probably at 130, 140. Yeah, but it's helped me learn like what causes the spikes that I should stay away from and things like that. And I think it's very useful. Again, this matters if it turns into symptoms, right? And for some people, it doesn't. And, it doesn't. That's why all this data is useful. But like sometimes some of this data, it doesn't turn into the thing that we're concerned about, these numbers. So, I mean, there's obviously a limitation to that where a certain number is going to always turn into a symptom if you get high enough on some of these numbers. But I would highly recommend, if you've never had a continuous glucose monitor, it's like go get one go to a primary care doctor, ask to get one, and then track your food and see what it does throughout the day and see what's happening. And it's like if you're going above 180 to 200 in your blood sugar from meals, like you need to probably have a conversation with your doctor. What do I do? Like, is this causing me a problem? And looking at how do you feel when your blood sugar is going that high and then when it comes back down. Very important stuff to do, if you haven't dove down that road and you want to, again, you're just about optimization really and prevention.
Yeah, it's about, Peter Attia talks about the distinction between lifespan and health span. So what good is it to add 10 years to your life if you're lying in bed and you can't do anything for yourself or go out and do the things you like to do that bring you joy and meaning in your life? So the health span conversation, I think, is important. I think most people would probably like to be able to retain their functionality, be able to do the things they like to do for as long as possible, or at least up to a certain time.
Yeah. Yep.
So, but there's also the risk if you're a compulsive, obsessive person like me of getting all the data and getting very obsessive about the optimizing
Sure.
the data. So that's a risk.
It's a risk.
That's when my wife has to step in and say, I think you need to stop collecting data for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. You got to chill out over there.
Well, let's talk about protein for a minute.
Protein.
There's been, I think, a pretty big shift in the conversation around how much protein is the right amount of protein now for a couple years.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in medical school, I was taught that a person who eats more than 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight per day is going to jeopardize their kidneys, going to hurt their kidneys. And I remember when I started learning about food and mood about 15 years ago, and I started counseling my patients for the first time on diet as a psychiatrist, I was telling people to really push it, push the envelope, get up to about 80 or, I would say, get 20 or 30 grams of protein per meal. Push it up to like 80 grams a day. And I thought it was being a little risque.
Right.
And I was counseling people who, in many cases weighed double that in their body weight per gram. I was asking people to push their protein intake up to 0.5 milligram per pound of body weight. And I thought that was really risky. Nobody got into any kind of problems with their kidneys, nobody. And I tested their function. So a couple years ago, some of the more advanced thought leaders in the health optimization space, like Andrew Huberman and Peter Attia, some others, started talking about, well, you know what, if you're going to be an active person and keep on your muscle mass, which arguably is really important for the health span conversation, you're going to need closer to 1 gram per pound of body weight. So, when you start thinking about consuming over 150 grams of protein a day, if you weigh more than 150 pounds, that's a lot of protein.
It's a lot.
It's a lot.
It's hard to get it in you.
It is.
Yeah. And it's even harder to get that in you if you're a vegetarian.
Really hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it's hard. And again, this is for when we get into those numbers, typically that's more athletic, muscle building numbers when you get that high.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. But even shooting for 0.5 gram per pound of body weight.
Not simple.
It's not simple. That easy.
It's not that easy when you start looking at how much is in your food. But, I think we are, generally speaking, protein light, especially when you look at the ratio to carbs that many people are eating. And it is hard to get that. And then to get it in a healthy food source is harder.
Exactly.
That's the other part that's really hard. You got to get in a healthy food source that have healthy fats in it and all of that. You have to kind of care. You can do it. I mean, it's all available at a grocery store or wherever, but you have to care to get it in clean fats and get the protein. And sometimes you need to do supplementation to get it, right?
Exactly.
Like protein shakes and things.
Protein shakes. And then what if you're dairy intolerant and you can't do whey?
Yeah.
And so on.
So there's all these, there's all these parts of it. But I think it's good you're bringing up protein because it's a lot of people know. So then you have a subset of people, they know they struggle with carbs. And they're going to have to eat carbs. We also eat some carbs, but they know that. But the thing they haven't dealt with sometimes is they're not eating enough protein. And then once you get your protein levels up, sometimes it actually straightens out some of the carb issues.
Right.
Once you get your proteins up, because it'll kill cravings if you get enough protein. I know there's thermal digestive properties when you start eating enough protein, and sometimes you'll start actually processing your carbs differently. So there's a lot of benefit in getting that protein count up.
Yeah, and just to underline a piece that you mentioned that's really important is the protein source. So, when you're going to the grocery to buy a steak, the wide preponderance or, majority of protein sources, if you're talking about beef, pork, chicken, these are animals that aren't generally in a conventional framework they're not taken good care of as animals. They're packed into small areas. They're fed things that are not great for them. The levels of inflammation in their bodies are quite high compared to animals that are given more space and more grass to eat and things like that. So the kind of fat that you find in a conventional steak, it tends to have a lot of pro-inflammatory types of fat in it that, kind of reverses to some degree the benefits of going out and getting that protein to boost up your protein. Totally. It's obviously really potentially extremely expensive and unavailable even in some areas to go look for an animal that was raised on pasture or that ate grass for its whole life. So then you have to get more creative, right? You have to go looking for sources of protein that are not completely absurdly expensive, but also that aren't reversing the benefits of boosting your protein. And then if you're looking at seafood, then aside from the expense, you're also looking at heavy metals that can accumulate in fish that are large fish that eat other fish. So as you move up the food chain and you get into things like albacore tuna or shark or swordfish, you're talking about very high levels of mercury sometimes. It can be very bad for your nervous system. So eating smaller fish like sardines or anchovies, for example, can be awesome if you can find them for a good price. So those are just some of my thoughts about how to, get the right kind of fats and the protein that you're looking for.
Well, why don't you go a little deeper into fats, actually, at this point. So why don't you just give a quick lowdown on fats, the lowdown and the down low on fats.
Yeah, great. So fats are a great topic and have only really come into focus in the last maybe 10 years as a really important thing in your diet. We were talking about the 70s where it was all about avoiding fat. In some ways, maybe that was a good idea in the 70s because a lot of the fat that you saw on the shelf was like trans fat and nobody even knew what that was at the time. But margarine is full of that, tends to be. So when we're talking about fats, there's sort of like two main categories. One is saturated fat and the other one's unsaturated fat. So in general, saturated fat is the kind of fat that you find in animal protein. Saturated fat is a great fuel source, but eating too much saturated fat can be counterproductive and can have negative effects on your health. So if you're really going as clean as you can, and again, as you said, there's a personalized conversation for individuals here, but you want to get plenty of unsaturated fat in your diet. So that's typically you're looking at plant sources of fat when you're looking at unsaturated fat. So these are things like extra virgin olive oil, avocados, coconut oil. What else? What were some of the things? What are some of the plant sources of fat that you would eat on the keto diet?
Well, you can eat avocados, nuts.
Nuts.
You can do the more like polyunsaturated fats. Fish. You mentioned.
Salmon, for example. High in that.
I think again, like the plant-based oils, avocados, nuts, and then fatty fish, of course, if you eat fish, is another one.
Now, there's a distinction to be made. We're getting a little bit granular here, but inside of plant fats, polyunsaturated fats, we're talking about two categories that you'll see when you read about this: omega-3 fats and omega-6 fats. So the correct ratio in our diet is a 1-to-1 ratio of omega-3s. Think about fish, salmon, fish oil, so on. That's omega-3s. And then the omega-6 is what you get from grains and seed oil. So this is another big contributing factor in fast food and processed food is there's a tremendous amount of seeds and seed oil. So it's very high in omega-6. And the standard American diet is way off on the ratio. It's 20-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3. Not enough to eat too much 6. So that's another thing to consider with plant-based fats is making sure you get enough of the omega-3s in there.
Right. Yeah. And so you mentioned the ketogenic diet, which is an interesting piece to just throw into the pot here. So the ketogenic diet is I always think of it as a prescriptive diet personally. Like you got to have a reason that you're going to try that. And you also want some guidance on it because you can, as you know, and like I ended up with a kidney stone on the ketogenic diet. There's some.
Yeah. You were not a happy camper that day. I remember.
Did I see you that day? Before I went to the hospital?
I was at the hospital with you.
But before I went, were you at the office with me?
Yeah, I told you. I was like, that guy's a kidney stone. I could tell.
Oh, yeah. Anyways, I was like sitting with a client. That was a rough, you know, what was rough? That was a really rough thing. I was sitting with a client who told me they were suicidal while a kidney stone was, you know, lodged, trying to make its way out. And I didn't know it was one. And I thought I was going to pass out, but I didn't want to leave the session. So I got out of the session and I drove myself 3 minutes down the road to the hospital where I didn't even think I was going to make it in the car. Anyways, that's the scary side of, you know, the cautionary tale of doing these things without proper guidance or, you know, watching your hydration levels, for instance. In my case, it's very easy to get dehydrated on the ketogenic diet. And you can also, you know, there's other things. But with all that said,
why did you end up going on the ketogenic diet?
Yeah. So, you know, I went on the ketogenic diet because of two factors. The main factor was I had, you know, daily chronic migraines for years and nothing was touching them. And I was like, what can I try? Like, what's left? And I had been doing research. Not that there was much research about, there wasn't a lot of research about ketogenic diet and migraines. But as you know, there's a lot of research around the ketogenic diet and seizures.
Right.
And so I was like, you know, and some neurologists will talk about migraines having some similarities to seizures in some way in terms of brain function and things. And I was like, I have to try this. So that was one reason. And then I was also still in a period of pretty significant mental health symptoms. And I'm like, let's see what it does. Like, I knew there were anti-inflammatory effects in the brain from doing the ketogenic diet. And I also knew I had unstable blood sugar. And I knew there was some data on the ketogenic diet regulating blood sugar levels. You know, corrective, where actually there'll be some durability even when you get off the ketogenic diet, where you can maybe light up your insulin receptors again for all those reasons, right? So I was on it for 9 months. This is over 10 years ago, I think. It's a while ago because it's got to be at least 10 years now, maybe 8 to 10 years ago. I was on it for 9 months until I got the kidney stone. That's when I came off it. But it completely got rid of daily migraines. I wasn't even getting migraines by the end. And ever since that round, again, daily migraines, the severe level at times for years. Now I get like a mild to moderate migraine less than a handful times a year since then. So that was such a radical thing for me. I'm not saying this is, you know, go try this if you have migraines, because I don't know. You know, there's not a ton of data on it. And then my mental health symptoms also went way down, way down. So I think the ketogenic diet is prescriptive. It's like a prescription. You know, you don't just do it for fun. Some people do it for fat loss because you'll start to burn fat in your body, because the ketogenic diet is converting your energy consumption from glucose to fat.
Right.
So you're going to start to burn a lot of fat. And that's fine. That might be a way for some people to get rid of some excess fat on their body if that's what they choose to do. And it's an interesting way to do it for sure. But it's also something to just be aware of like, you're dealing with some symptoms, you know, you have to talk to your provider about it. Like, it might be a good experiment to see if it can help for some period of time.
What would you say that, what's been you mentioned how doing a intervention, like in your case, 9 months, can have longer lasting effects after that intervention is over. What's the report on, do you feel like that reset your migraines more or less permanently from that? Wow.
Reset them permanently.
Wow.
In my case, I also know of some people with migraines that tried it and it didn't work for them.
Yeah.
But in my case, it definitely changed the migraine pattern permanently, which is cool.
One of the things, and we could do a whole show on the ketogenic diet, but I do want to say that one of the big issues with keto is actually getting into ketosis, is what it's called.
It's a big issue.
It's a big issue. And the thing is, a lot of people, and I'm talking about myself here too, when I tried it, is a lot of people don't, number one, limit their carbs enough. Number two, they continue to eat too much protein with respect to fat. So in the keto diet, as I understand it, it's 80% of your calories are fat-based, right?
Yeah.
And
the amount of carbs is typically very low, you know.
Under 20
It could be
grams,
under
right?
20 usually.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on your body size, but it could be under 20.
Yeah.
You're talking about you can't even have an apple.
Can't have an apple. You're done.
Ever. Well,
And you got
during
to
the
watch the
diet.
tomatoes on your salad.
Yeah, because you're talking, you can end up with 5-8 grams of carbs right there. So like you have to count it. But that's if you want it, you're either in keto or you're not, right? So
Well, yeah. So that's what I was going to say is that I didn't do a good job of checking. There are now more modern ways, like I think they have like a breath test and like you can do a finger.
they have
stick.
those, but they're okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the problem with urine, they measure ketones, but like if you're dehydrated, you're going to show high ketones anyways. So they're not, it's not like a total scientific thing. You can't rely on it. That would help. You could do a finger stick, but I think that it helps. But I think, you really have to go down to counting what you're putting in your body.
Yeah.
And I don't think you should do it alone. Like, I think you really need a professional because I got myself into trouble there. And but I also, 9 months is that's very typical to go 9 months on the ketogenic diet. That's not a typical length. That's long.
Longer than most people would need to do.
Yeah. Most people 3 to 4 months, they're done.
Yeah. So it's a metabolic intervention. It's not without risk. It's kind of extreme. Yeah. I mean, it's sort of like you would never start with going to the ketogenic diet from a standard American diet necessarily, if you could get your metabolic problems addressed without having to go there.
Yeah, it's extreme. And, infants are in ketosis basically, so it's not unfamiliar to our bodies.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I think it's fascinating, the physiology of ketosis. I guess basically what I want to say about it is that, the energy needs of the body are met either from, as you said earlier, glucose or fat. And we have these organelles in our cells that are sort of like the battery packs for cells that produce energy. And they do it by breaking down either glucose or fat. Breaking down glucose is it's a little bit like a nuclear reactor in a way, because it's kind of dangerous for the mitochondria to handle glucose because of a thing called a reactive oxygen species, which is a side effect, or it's a byproduct of breaking down glucose. You've probably heard the term free radicals, right? That's stuff that can damage tissue in the body. And reactive oxygen species is another name for that can actually damage your cells to burn sugar as a fuel only. And so what's been emerging in the last probably year or so is like this conversation about metabolic flexibility of mitochondria that have the ability fluidly to use what fuel's available. Maybe sometimes you have fat available, maybe it's sometimes glucose. But what happens often for people is eating a standard American diet, you're going to get stuck in burning glucose, and your mitochondria are used to that. And it's like running a very high octane kind of dangerous fuel, if you will, in your mitochondria that your body would use evolutionarily, probably not that often. In caveman diet, probably not getting a lot of added sugar or, high fructose corn syrup or highly processed carbs in that diet. You're burning stored fat while you go look for food for days on end.
I mean, there's no doubt that hundreds of thousands of years ago or millions of years ago, there's no doubt that our ancestors were entering ketosis.
Frequently.
There's no doubt about that. Yeah.
So,
but you can, if you eat too much protein, you're not going to be in ketosis.
That's right.
So there's also, they weren't always in ketosis probably, because they were eating high amounts of proteins at times.
Right. So Keith is explaining that when you eat a lot of protein and not very much fat or carbohydrate, what happens to the protein is you actually convert that into sugar and then burn that in the mitochondria. So it goes through a sugar pathway to convert protein into fuel for metabolism. But my point is that the mitochondria don't, to put it simply, they don't run so hot or burn as many dangerous side effects or side products when they're burning fat as they do with sugar. So sugar is meant to be a infrequently used but necessary quick hit of energy, and the mitochondria like to burn fat as a baseline, is what we think about, is our theory about sort of caveman metabolism. And one of the problems, so to speak, with modernization and urbanization and living in a country where you can grab, or really anywhere in the world now, you can grab a sugary or glucosey snack anytime you want. You're never going through the adaptive, beneficial, physiological benefit of not being able to find food for a while, right?
Yeah, and I think that, if we just keep talking about this from like more of an evolutionary perspective, the higher carb diet is pretty new.
Yeah.
It comes when we develop agriculture. It's not that long, let's say it's 10,000 years, 12,000 years. We start
10,000. Sure.
Yeah. So we get carbohydrate rich crops starting. And now it's possible that we weren't as sensitive at first. I don't know, to the carbohydrates, but over time, it's clear that we're getting sensitive to carbohydrates, these high carbohydrate diets.
Well, I think we're less sensitive to ancestral grains.
We are less sensitive to ancestral grains, and grains obviously were different 10,000 years ago.
Yeah.
That's true too.
Yeah. And then we have the whole Roundup glyphosate issue with grains nowadays.
Yeah. So with that said, you actually have to have a good amount of education to know what's going on here. Like, you need to understand a lot, like what happened in history, that here we are, this is the options we have, and our bodies are not designed from an evolutionary perspective typically to handle the diets that we're mostly consuming, right? And that's where, that's what this conversation is about. Like, okay, well, more education you have, and then you slowly chip away at it and hopefully design a type of food plan that works for you in your body. And it's not easy, right? There's a lot of options around us in terms of what to eat. I mean, think about that. How many options we have in general, like when you go in a grocery store.
Yeah, it's incredible.
Thousands of options.
Yeah.
Probably tens of thousands of options in any one grocery store, like a big grocery store. That's a lot of options.
Yeah. It's a lot of options.
And then our ancestors, they didn't have tens of thousands of options. So it was, they were presented with what was in front of them that they had to go find. And it was very limited options. So, sometimes options create new problems. Sometimes, in this case, there's some problems here with all these options.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I mean, processed food, pro-inflammatory food that's, empty calories or too rich in refined carbohydrate. You can find this kind of food in any health store. I like going into these little mom and pop health stores and all over wherever I go and when I travel, and they're full of these kinds of foods.
It's true. Yeah. So it takes some effort to just learn, but that's what we're here to do. We're here to learn.
Yeah.
What else have we here?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good overview of.
That's a good brush stroke. Food and mood and mind and body, longevity, and we're here to learn.
Yeah, I mean, I think one piece that we could get into another time is the micronutrients. We talked about macronutrients today. If you're doing a pretty good job with a well-rounded, let's say Mediterranean style diet, is not too heavy on carbs and enough healthy fats and a good amount of protein and so on, you're probably going to do pretty okay with your micronutrients. But I'm talking about vitamins and minerals, which are critical for cellular functions, metabolic health. But there is some evidence to support the view that farming that depletes the soil of vitamins and minerals can cause people who eat an organic diet or relatively healthy diet to be a little short on micronutrients. So it's good to keep that in mind as well. But we could expand on that a lot in a different conversation. Right. Yeah.
Cool. All right. We'll end there.
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, I'll see you at Wendy's. Bye.